1.9, Federalism in Action. This is the last part of the first unit. Only 5 more to go after this. The sharing of powers. We're going to start with environmental policymaking. Big idea. Multiple actors and institutions interact to produce and implement possible policies. Okay, so the executive branch and background on environmental policy. So basically, the executive branch was like the first to say anything on environmental policy. And President Teddy Roosevelt was the one who did. He is also known as the conservationist president because of he liked the natural beauty and resources of the US, and he set aside a bunch of stuff as public land, established a bunch of national parks, and he was able to do so much of this environmental protection because he thought the president was the steward of the people. Basically, he could claim broader powers and expand the power of the president in order to help the American people, for the good of the people. Now, Congress and environmental legislation. So 1960s, 1970s is when the public kind of got along to the environmental movement, and Congress started regulating this industry. So they started setting environmental standards. But people in business and stuff usually opposed these regulations. And so environmental policy is this fight between environmental activists and conservative free market ideals. There are a few bolded terms to know, acts that the government has made, Congress has made. So, Clean Air Act, improved air quality and a decreased amount of contaminants in the air. Basically, Department of Transportation has to reduce automobile emissions. Basically, Department of Transportation, this department underneath the executive branch, they have to cut down the amount of gases and emissions from such vehicles. Clean Water Act regulates water pollutants and has quality standards and monitors those. And the Endangered Species Act created this program that meant the National Fish and Wildlife Service could protect endangered species. And after this toxic waste disaster, the Superfund was created. Because in that disaster, the federal government made the industry pay for insurance to manage the byproducts that were polluting the area. And this company had put a bunch of chemicals in this area, and that area later became a residential place, and then the people living there got these serious health problems. So Congress made the Superfund, and basically the industry pays to the Superfund, and it's an insurance. So that means that taxpayers don't have to pay for waste cleanup. Instead, the Superfund pays for waste cleanup. Although that is when the guilty party is unknown or bankrupt, so that fund will pay for it. Otherwise, if there is a guilty party, the guilty party will pay for it. Now, clashes between branches over environmental policy. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, oversees Superfund, toxic waste cleanup, and makes states set quality standards for air and reduce damage, etc., etc. So 2012, EPA set limits on how much coal and oil-fueled power plants could emit of these hazardous chemicals. Yes, this would cost the plants nearly $10 billion, but the risk of human health because of it justified the regulation. However, then the Supreme Court, our other branch that's clashing, they overturned this regulations because this is a huge cost burden. And they check and balanced the EPA, which is part of the federal government, executive branch. Disagreements over climate change. You should know what climate change is. Greenhouse gases attribute to global warming, which means global temperatures rising and the climate changing. And the Kyoto Protocol, which is this agreement between a bunch of countries, and they'll sign, and they say, we're gonna reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we agree to the terms of this protocol. That happened, and the US president at the time, Bill Clinton, he was yeah, we should do it. But the US Senate was no. So then the US did not sign the treaty. U.S. Senate was more conservative-leaning. And then during Obama, Senate stayed conservative-leaning, and the government couldn't join this Paris Agreement, which was similar to the Kyoto Protocol, like multi-country agreement on climate change stuff. But Obama kind of went around this using the executive order without the approval of the Senate, but then Trump used like that same little bypass method to withdraw from it. State initiatives. So many states adhere to the guidelines in the Paris Agreement anyway, even though like they're not bound to it, which is another check and balance in the federal system. So like California, their state companies have to buy permits in order to release greenhouse gas emissions. So more like check and balances with environment. Now, political participation and policy making. Legalizing marijuana. This shows how policy changes to adapt to like attitudes of the citizens. So marijuana entered the US, and as it moved like further into the country, states began outlawing it using their police powers. Now, congressional policy, federal government first acted in 1932 with the Uniform State Narcotics Act, which was basically states, you should make marijuana and other drugs illegal. And then there was like this campaign and this movie, and it brought attention to how drugs can really mess a person up. So the House passed this act to try to regulate the substance, and end of 1930s, most states and Congress had criminalized marijuana. Although drug enforcement was handled by state and local police, other than like interstate stuff. In 1970, by that point, the Controlled Substances Act was a federal drug policy, part of Nixon's War on Drugs, first federal law to enforce and heavily punish marijuana dealers and users. Large parts of that I was reading from the book and you could see. And a Gallup organization was like, only 12% of people through this poll thought that it should be legal. So it reflected what like the people were thinking. The federal government had pushed more on like making marijuana and other drugs illegal and like serious under federal law. Citizen influence balancing liberty and order. But throughout the 1970s and 80s, people's opinions shifted. Research, public education, advocacy, all of that made people more accepting of marijuana use. Some states started like reducing punishments. The medical community began to recognize how such like plants could be used for medicinal purposes and like pain relief. California, first state to legalize medicinal marijuana, and that was through a statewide vote, which shows participatory democracy actually. More and more states had similar bills, and it legalized, it was approved, and then October 2013 it says, Gallup had a similar poll, and a majority of Americans supported this legalization. Although not every state succeeded in legalizing it. Presidential and judicial policymaking. So, you know that Controlled Substances Act I mentioned earlier? That's still federal law. So then what happens, like, if the state legalized marijuana, but the drug's still illegal, like, at a national level? Like, what's the deal there? And that really depends. So during Bush's administration, W. Bush, federal authorities were much more intense and cracked down, especially in California, which we talked about, first place it was legalized. But then people sued, but then the Supreme Court was like, yeah, Congress can determine what can be bought and sold, and so this federal marijuana crime, those are upheld. But then, like, during when Obama was president, many states legalized recreational marijuana. And he was like, the Justice Department isn't going to use federal resources to crack down on selling, using drugs in states where it was deemed illegal, like legal. Like, if the states are okay with it, we're not going to get into that with them. So federal arrests for marijuana, non-existent, basically. And so administration to administration, it's kind of inconsistent, because then Trump's administration was different than Obama's, that type of stuff. Now, shared policymaking and education, there's a little table I'm going to go really, really quickly through. Brown v. Board of Education, segregation in public education, unconstitutional, decided by the Supreme Court. Elementary and Secondary Education Act, federal funding offered to states if they met requirements of the act, decided by U.S. Congress, and state governments had to cooperate. No Child Left Behind Act, states held accountable for student achievement under federal supervision, deciding body, U.S. Congress. Every Student Succeeds Act returned accountability back to the states. U.S. Congress